Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Good morning to those of you on the West Coast and in Tasmania, and good afternoon and evening to everyone on the East Coast and Europe. Welcome to today's presentation. My name is Judy Kitt, and I'm the current president of the Foundation for Mind Being Research, or FMBR. For those of you who are new to us, I just want to let you know that FMBR was founded 41 years ago now, in 1980, by scientists and healers and artists who were interested in exploring the nature of human consciousness through the lens of science, spirituality, and ancient wisdom traditions. We're among a growing group of organizations who are helping to create a cultural shift away from exclusively reductionist approaches to science, so that we can have a fuller understanding of the range of human experience and the nature of reality. I encourage you to check us out at fmbr.org. And you can see all of our past presentations on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, which is called FMBR TV. So we're very honored to have Dr. Emma Bragdon with us this morning. She's the founder and executive director of Integrative Mental Health for You, IMHU.org, which I will put in the chat. This organization is dedicated to educating about the full range of effective options to improve mental health without over-reliance on psychiatric medication. Emma earned her doctorate at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology in 1987 and was licensed as a psychotherapist shortly thereafter. In the late 1980s, she wrote 2 of the foundational books on spiritual emergency. She's been in private practice with a special focus on supporting those in psychospiritual crisis since 1988. From 2001 to 2012, she studied 6 months of each year in Brazil, learning about Spiritism and guiding 60 groups interested in getting spiritual healing from famous healers in Brazil. During that time, she also published 3 books and co-produced 2 documentary films about Spiritism. She's particularly impressed with how Spiritists can help identify and help people in psychospiritual crises to manage their spiritual emergency. So Dr. Bragdon, welcome, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much, Judy. It's an honor to be invited and to be here with you today. And just a little tech reference, I don't see the record button on. Does that need to be on or not?
It is recording on YouTube.
Okay, great. Wonderful. So shall I just start now?
You can go right ahead. And just as a reminder, if you have questions, go ahead and just type them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end.
Thank you. Okay, so welcome everybody. I'm delighted that we have people from all over the world, and it seems like there is just a huge amount of interest right now in medical intuition. So I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping so I can share my screen with you, and I have prepared some slides. Enjoy the elephant while I get this going.
I should note that Dr. Bragdon took that photo. It looks like a professional photo, but it's gorgeous.
We're having the same trouble I had a moment ago now. This isn't coming up. Opening. You know, it's such a curious thing. I found that if you're involved with some of the more subtle energies in the world, frequently there's just some obstructions that come up. So I'm thinking if I go to PowerPoint, but that doesn't look like I can.
That's so weird because it worked 10 minutes
ago.
Here we go.
Here we go. Just a little bit of patience needed. Okay, so I don't know if that's a Brazilian or not in the surf, but what I do know is that as we're talking about medical intuition and healing, we're dealing with huge energies that are God-given. And the trick really is to stay in balance and be able to enjoy the ride, we could say, but also deal with these energies in a balanced way. So I'm going to proceed. The agenda today is I'm going to tell a little bit about how I found Spiritism And I need to speak a little bit about spiritual emergency because especially with the Brazilian Spiritists, they have become extraordinary in terms of recognizing when a person is in a psycho-spiritual crisis and noticing the difference between that and what we call mental illness. So I will cover what Spiritism is in a nutshell, because many people don't know much about it. How the Spiritists recognize and treat spiritual emergency, the training of mediums and healers, some of the successes that have gone on with the mediums and healers in Brazil, some research that has been done and is now ongoing, and then I'll give you some resources for further exploration. I'll tell you that some of the slides are quite dense, and if you want, for instance, to know about the resources, you might want to get out your smartphone so that you can take a picture of the slide. So in the 1990s, I was teaching a course called actually the Avatar course, which brought people into higher states of consciousness in a very safe way. And as a result of my not only taking the course, but becoming an advanced trainer, I was invited to go to Brazil. And so in March of 2001, I flew into Brasilia, which is the capital of Brazil, and I proceeded to do the teaching of less experienced teachers. And then I went over to visit John of God, who is a spiritual healer. And I was really on a mission there. I didn't need healing for myself, but a very dear and close friend of mine, I'll call Jim, who is paraplegic, asked if I would visit John of God and whether John of God might be able to benefit him. Well, I had quite an extraordinary experience in that first day when I met John of God, the healer, because first of all, the words out of his mouth in Portuguese were, "I know you." And I had no idea what he was referring to. And then I walked outside to get grounded because I had had a huge energetic experience, literally shaking all over. I could barely stand. And many of the psychic mediums who worked at John of God's center supporting him came up to me. I didn't know who they were, but I later found out. They came up to me and said, "Oh, you're here because you're going to bring Spiritism to the rest of the world." I didn't know the word Spiritism. I didn't know what they were talking about. I wondered if they were manipulating me or what the program was here. But what that led to, starting that particular evening, was I sat at the same table with, or I was introduced to leaders in Spiritism, and they then invited me to go and visit Spiritist centers throughout Brazil. And that led to not only learning a lot about it, but also being inspired to write books about it, because very few people know about what is going on in Spiritism in Brazil. But I had to ask myself the question, if there's so much happening here, and we'll be talking about it, why haven't I heard about this before? Was I asleep in graduate school? Because I have a PhD in transpersonal psychology, it must have been mentioned. What about Houston Smith and William James and C.G. Jung? I mean, all of them would be extremely interested in this. But as it turned out, when I got home and hit the books, none of them mention it. So it's a curiosity to me how it's been kept so quiet. So I'll just do a very brief summary. The two books on the top left are books that I wrote about spiritual emergency in around 1990. And that has been my focus actually since the 1980s. And then when I went to Brazil, I became so interested in Spiritism, and it was as if the books and the inspiration also to create two films came to me out of a download or an incredible inspiration, along with the energy to manifest it. So I was traveling a lot, interviewing a lot, and writing books and creating films. And Kardec's Spiritism, which is in this upper right, is a book that describes several centers of Spiritism in Brazil. The on the upper right corner is actually a documentary film on Spiritism, which is these are all available on Amazon. And then the bottom right, Spiritism and Mental Health, is a bit more academic, and it was a book that I edited because I basically collected chapters from psychiatrists and psychologists who live and work and are spiritists in Brazil. And so translated them and off we go into the book. And there are some researchers as well, and as psychologists, psychiatrists from outside of Brazil that comment on the successes of Spiritism. So if you're really interested in other resources and in research in particular, Spiritism and Mental Health would be the place to go. So just a minute. Okay, I'm right on then. So I wanted to just introduce a little bit the idea of spiritual emergency, because I want to talk about why we would value medical intuition. And since I have had a specialty of working with people in spiritual emergency, I have been able to meet many people who have thought that they were likely crazy because of very intense spiritual experiences that they were having. Some of them had actually been in hospitals, and later to find out that the diagnoses that they were given and the treatment they were given were probably not appropriate for them. And actually they, with more discernment and more education, they came to realize that they had had spiritual experiences that were leading them in a very different direction, and they were not crazy. So the woman here was a client of mine, and I can talk about this because she's published a book. Her name is Michelle McCann, and she had been hearing voices and was very frightened by it. Her family thought she should be hospitalized for a while under the supervision of a psychiatrist. So for 12 years, she had the identity that she was mentally ill because she was hearing voices, and there were odd experiences that were happening that she couldn't make sense of. And her psychiatrist couldn't either. So she was put on medication, whether she was in the hospital or not. And it was considered a breakdown and likely the result of some kind of chemical imbalance. But as she came out of the hospital, she was still extremely interested in spirituality. So she read more. She sought me out to talk to me. She also sought out some classes eventually in nurturing psychic skills. And she began to realize that the voices that she'd been hearing actually were coming from a higher dimension. None of them were negative at all. And that at this point, of course, I'm making a long story very short, she is channeling and giving readings, and she has recently written a book called The Nature of God, The Revelation. So she's particularly interesting because she does have MSW, she's licensed, and she was a supervisor for other social workers. So she has a very strong sense of mission that she wants to let people know that everybody has the experience of connecting with these large energies and being able to channel from higher intelligence. But it took her quite a while and through years of thinking herself mentally ill before she got to that point. So this is the reason that I've really focused in on medical intuition, because it takes a lot of discernment to be able to tell, is someone in a process where they're really breaking down, or are they in a process where they're breaking out or breaking open into more of their human potential. So what Michelle went through and what many people go through who have big spiritual experiences is very similar to an existential crisis, a sense of, wait a minute, who am I really? But But within a spiritual emergency, there are always very strong spiritual experiences. So what is the most needed in order to have a positive outcome in a spiritual emergency, as Michelle has had, because she's leading a life now where she's on no psychiatric medications at all, and she is continuing on doing social work, but for the most part, she's also opening up to being a channel for others and empowering others with their own abilities to open up psychically. So obviously, the healthcare providers who are working with people who are having these intense spiritual experiences need to be very discerning. But unfortunately, the discernment of spiritual emergency is not taught in our medical schools or in our graduate schools, except in very unusual ones or extraordinary ones. So most healthcare providers don't have that discernment, at least from their education and skill building in graduate school. So some people, as they approach this zone, if they have their boots on the ground in spirituality, might say, well, wait a minute, all life is spiritual awakening. So, and mental disturbance doesn't exist. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have some conventional healthcare providers who are steeped in the biomedical model who are saying, but all spiritual experiences are delusional. So there's a lot of polarizing that goes on in this particular field. And one of the reasons I was drawn to what goes on in Brazil is because that kind of polarizing is not going on in the specific Spiritist centers and Spiritist psychiatric hospitals. So I'm basically calling out for more discernment, which also has to rest on more education about this area. So even people who are having a life experience like Michelle can also discern more easily that maybe they aren't crazy, and maybe they wouldn't then have to go through 12 years or even more of thinking that they were had mental illness. I love this particular cartoon because it strikes me personally. The problem is I can't tell the difference between a deeply wise, intuitive nudge from the universe and one of my own boneheaded ideas. And I don't think I'm alone in that. We all are hopefully growing towards more and more discernment, not only through education and life experience, but through our own maybe meditation and other spiritual practices, which tune up our intuition. But again, I just want to note that the Spiritists are extraordinary with their discernment, which really is the key for appropriate diagnosis. The other thing that I found out and was very drawn to about the Spiritists as I learned about them was that they have a profound understanding of energy and how to apply healing energy, which is can be important in diagnosis, but especially is a key for managing a spiritual awakening that is intense and maybe disorienting for someone. And again, another component that's extremely important for people who are going through a spiritual awakening can be loving compassion and fellowship with others. So that, again, we could call a key for managing the spiritual emergency. Okay, so what is this thing that I'm calling Spiritism? So first of all, notice that this is not a misspelling. So many people will say, well, isn't it the same as spiritualism? No, Spiritism was actually coined by this unhappy looking academic, Allan Kardec, which is a nom de plume. But he was an academic and was working in education in the 1850s. And at that particular point, table tipping and psychic mediums were kind of fashionable. And so he dropped in on it to just check out what was going on and became extremely interested and involved. So he created Spiritism with the reasoning that spiritualism, as it was being practiced back in the 1850s, was really oriented towards phenomenon. In other words, look at the table tipping. Oh, look at the manifestations that are happening. Oh, look, the spirit seems to have shown up. Oh, who's going to show up tonight? These are all phenomenon, which can be extremely interesting. But what Kardec decided to do was ask questions of about 1,000 mediums about really what we can understand about the meaning of life, where we're going, what happens after death, and the interaction of spirits with people who are alive. And as a result of that, he said, okay, what I understand now is that the whole reason for life is spiritual evolution. So Spiritism is distinct from spiritualism because it says we're moving in the direction of spiritual evolution. We're moving in the direction of supporting each other in spiritual evolution. We're not just looking at and being entranced by phenomenon. So other things that he collated from the mediums that he interviewed was that karma is alive and well, and is acting in our lives all the time. Reincarnation happens. Psychic mediums are, some being better than others, can in fact be very accurate in their connection to higher forces. And we can gain a lot from our connection to higher forces, but we need to be extremely careful that we don't open ourselves to all spirits, because some may want to play with us, or some are ignorant, or some may even cause us harm. So one of the very important parts of Spiritism is that they wanted to align themselves with a spiritual ideal, and many of the Spiritists will take Christ as that ideal, but Spiritism itself is universal, ecumenical, welcomes all people, and so it is not just a Christian organization. And it's truly a fellowship that supports spiritual evolution in each person. Now, the symbol for Spiritism is a triangle, and just think of it as each point representing either philosophy, science, or ethics. So Spiritism is not a religion, it's basically a philosophy, and it considers that science is more important than anything, and I'll use the famous word trump. Science trumps all the phenomena that might happen. So Kardec said, if science comes out with something that contradicts anything that are in the 5 foundational books that he wrote, then we need to follow science. And the third point, ethics, was considered by the spirits. In other words, this is what was transmitted by the spirits, that if you want to grow spiritually, you need to have your ethics really in place. In other words, lead an ethical life. Also something that the spiritualists of the time didn't necessarily follow. So all of his work makes it abundantly clear that if you're going to get into the zone of communicating with spirits, you have to be very, very clear about who you want to communicate with, because again, there are a range of spirits in terms of their intelligence and their goodwill. There's a range of spirits in the spirit world similar to what's in the human world. So we have to be very careful about who it is we want to communicate with. And therefore, the mediums are always trained to work specifically with the most intelligent, most loving, most compassionate beings. So is this some way out thing that's going on, like a little cult in Brazil? I wondered that. And then I found out that there are about 13,000 Spiritist Community Centers in Brazil. Again, they're supporting spiritual evolution and ecumenical, so they welcome all people of all ages. They provide classes and study groups, studying some of Kardec's materials, but also some more recent authors. And they the big centers have provision for kids, kindergarten, all the way through elders. The other thing that goes on at these Spiritist centers is that they always have some kind of volunteer work, like a soup kitchen, or providing clothing for people who are extremely poor, or providing medical care for people who are extremely poor. So they might open up on Saturdays to dentists and doctors and naturopaths who come in and provide free care. The other thing they do is they train mediums and healers at the Spiritist Community Centers. So some people will want to learn these particular skills so that they can help others in the community centers. But the ones that take on the most advanced training and are the most skillful are then invited to work at the Spiritist psychiatric hospitals with people who are patients there. In other words, very vulnerable population. But the training happens in the Spiritist community centers. So again, I thought, well, maybe there's one Spiritist psychiatric hospital in all of Brazil, because this is just so different than what I've known before. But there are actually 50 of them. And I don't know of any other Spiritist psychiatric hospitals anywhere else in the world. So as far as I know, they're only in Brazil. And I've visited several of them in several different cities, being the honored guest of the administration. And what I could see is that they are offering the very best of conventional biomedical psychiatric care. In other words, they have the meds there, but in addition, they're offering Spiritist therapies, and they're usually taking a very cautious approach to psychiatric medication and preferring other forms of therapy. One of the things that has been of great interest to me, because I am interested in research, is that the mediums collaborate with the psychiatrists. So that means in the record keeping, you might have what the psychiatrists, you would have what the psychiatrists are recording about a particular patient, but then next to it, you would also find what the mediums, meaning the medical intuitives, as well as psychic mediums and healers, have observed about that same patient. So it gives a multidimensional look into the diagnosis, and in many cases into the treatment as well, of people who are coming in. And these Spiritist psychiatric hospitals, the larger ones, can offer both residential and outpatient care. So, of course, with my background being extremely interested in spiritual emergency, I was looking for how they recognized that particular process and how they treated it. And what I saw was, obviously they use a different language, not only Portuguese, but different words too, for the designation of spiritual emergency, but that actually they've been working with it for over 100 years in their psychiatric hospitals and in their community centers. So just so you can get a flavor of how frequently you might see a Spiritist center, think of a convenience store on the corner of a block in the city and how frequently you might see them. Well, actually, there are Spiritist centers on that show up in a lot of the cities, but they are appealing to people who want to come in and get help in terms of the spiritual perspective on whatever is going on for them that is disturbing, either emotionally or physically. And these Spiritist centers are very easy to find. They are serving about 1/5 of the population. So that means 20 to 40 million people will go to the Spiritist centers for help. That doesn't mean that they're going to consider themselves a member of Spiritism, but that they will use the resources of the Spiritist Center. So the name that they have, and again, this is kind of a translation from the Portuguese, which I don't think is especially good, but it in the literature, you would find it, the designation repressed mediumicity. So we could say, well, maybe they're really meaning that someone who is in a spiritual emergency is actually a medium, but that mediumship has been repressed. So that's getting closer. But as I've gone into this area now, since 2001, I've been studying it. I think it's really repressed sensitivities. And so we could think of Michelle in this case, who didn't have any kind of cognitive framework to recognize that she might in fact be a medium or might in fact be a channel. That was outside of her language completely. And she needed to be brought into not only the language of what might be going on with her as a intuitive, but also be brought into the energy of allowing that to go through her system and be brought into fellowship with others who had that particular facility, so that she realized that she wasn't just a duck out of water. And I want to tell you also about a man by the name of Marcelo, a Brazilian man who has not written a book as far as I know, but Marcelo was a particular person that I met at the Palmelo Spiritus Psychiatric Hospital. That's in Palmelo, Brazil. And he had actually been given the diagnosis of depression when he was 29, and under the care of one of the most excellent psychiatrists in Sao Paulo. They'd asked him about trauma, and he basically had very, very little trauma. You know, everyone has a sprinkling of family dysfunction, but he had had no trauma. And the depression had hit him after he'd already started working in the world. He was in his late 20s. And unfortunately, it devolved into what the psychiatrist called schizophrenia. He was hospitalized, given antipsychotics, but just was in terrible shape and getting worse and worse. So his parents took him out and eventually found the Spiritist Psychiatric Hospital. And Marcelo, as he was introduced in the hospital, was given exactly what you would find in a conventional hospital. So he was given a physical checkup by a medical doctor. He talked to a social worker who talked again about identifying any kind of psychosocial stressors that were going on as part of the diagnostic procedure. But he was also seen by a medical intuitive, and this particular man was extremely gifted and also the head of the hospital. And they saw immediately that Marcelo was basically a medium in the rough and with special healing abilities. But Marcelo, what had been indoctrinated into the idea that he basically had a mental illness, would have it for the rest of his life, was really seriously in trouble. And so Marcelo's process, again, was speaking with other people who were gifted as he was, and beginning to not only get a different language, in other words, have a cognitive framework for the gifts that he had, but also fellowship with others like himself. And within a few months, Marcelo went from being a patient in that hospital to joining the healers who were coming into the hospital to help the patients. So he was now living outside the hospital in a rental, getting training at the local Spiritist Community Center, and going with a group of other healers to help the patients who were in the hospital. Imagine how uplifting that would be for the patients to see someone who had been with them as a patient now operating very successfully as a healer. And Marcelo went on to really flourish in terms of becoming a channel as well. So the medical intuitives that I was able to meet in Brazil were able to not only diagnose what was going on with a person without that person necessarily even being present. So it was a remote viewing, and they could see not only the energy field of the person, their aura, but also inside the body. So did they have any particular physical issues? And some of these medical intuitives were able to also channel from higher intelligence what kind of treatment would work for that unique person. So this is not a one-size-fits-all kind of process. The medical intuitives were also able to see if a negatively motivated spirit was impacting the patient. So in Marcelo's case, they did not see any of them, but the medical intuitives also strongly suggest that all of the patients get a kind of energy work twice a week in the hospitals. And during that kind of energy work, which is a non-touch but work, the healers are actually helping the patients to clear their energy field as well as stay balanced in their body. So the medical intuitives can also pick up the positive spirits that are impacting the person, possibly in Marcelo's case, then his spirit guides. And again, what kind of treatment they would need, ideally. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over these two stories because there's a lot more to go. So I mentioned that each person is unique. And so in Marcelo's case, they were recognizing that when he came into the hospital, he was still on antipsychotics. And so they were assisting him to make that transition, not only into a new way of thinking about himself, but also withdraw in a supervised fashion from the psych meds. So when I met him, he was on a very, very modest dose, a subclinical dose of antipsychotics. What's also involved with the treatment either inside the Spiritist Psychiatric Hospital or in the community is energy work, as I mentioned. And that would be a whole session to describe exactly how the energy work, but I have a slide a little further on that I can tell you a little bit more. But it's basically channeling positive energy to assist someone. In the same way that they channel positive, the healers channel positive energy, to a person, they also channel positive energy to water, which is happens through prayer, as well as focused energy. And that water is considered to be part of the treatment for the people in the hospital or in the community centers. So what I saw was people take that quite seriously and are really happy to bring a jug of water to be blessed by the mediums and then to take it home and have some each day. Prayer is a very important part of the work that goes on. So before any talk or before a class or before any kind of training, there's always a prayer that's said, and frequently after the event as well. And fellowship is extended to people in the hospitals. In other words, you might have a spiritist who's not in the hospital, who aligns and comes in as a volunteer just to offer a kind of unconditional love and fellowship to a person in the hospital, which can be, of course, extremely helpful for anyone feeling isolated or alone in a psychiatric hospital, or just someone who's absorbed in their own personal problems. Compassionate understanding is essential then. So we might call that peer support from our perspective of the United States. But the other thing that's offered, and this happens more in the community centers than in the hospitals, just is creating a kind of cognitive framework. And in Marcelo's case, of course, this was extremely important because all he knew was that he was hearing voices, and he had this experience of things running up and down his body like bugs or rodents. And so he had taken to just kind of wiping them off all the time. And he was in an irritable state. But as he realized more, as he read and as he talked to people, he started recognizing that this was just a manifestation of energy that was coming to him that he needed to learn how to channel. And so not only creating the cognitive framework, but studying materials and acquiring skills was important in Marcelo's case. In the Spiritist psychiatric hospitals, there is also therapy that's offered. Physical treatment may be important, many kinds of therapy. And I've aligned myself with hospitals and community centers in Brazil, which are quite up to date. They're using Hellinger family systems work, for instance. They're using all kinds of naturopathic treatments. They may have patients go out into a permaculture garden and work with gardening or work with animals. So if a patient is not responding to any of the therapies that are offered, which include, group therapy, but if someone is not responding, they're still depressed or they're still extremely anxious, then the Spiritist will offer a disobsession. Now, in a hospital setting, someone like Marcelo would authorize that Spiritist treatments can be given to him while he's in the hospital. And in a community center, someone would likely ask for disobsession or somehow give permission, sometimes written permission, so that this can be done. But in the hospital setting, the patient doesn't know that they're being given a disobsession session. So it's done completely remotely. And I'll go into more what that is. But for now, just think of disobsession as being depossession. So a negatively motivated spirit might have attached itself to a human being. And the mediums in the disobsession session will be attempting and very successful in separating that negative spirit and assisting the negative spirit to go on into the light. At the same time, they're assisting the patient to be without this negative entity anymore, and the impact of that negatively motivated entity is brought into their life. So this graphic I have here is because in certain situations like Marcelo or Michelle, these people are really like diamonds in the rough. Maybe it's charcoal or coal because they just can't see themselves or the potential that lies within them. But with some help, they can become the diamonds. So there's a tremendous amount of information on this particular slide, but I just wanted to show you two pictures of two people in Brazil who are in their 40s now and are really making a very strong attempt to get more out into international medical publications about Spiritism. So I've been fortunate enough to become friends with both of them. This is Dr. Luchetti on the left and Dr. Moreira Almeida on the right. So if you want to learn more about what's going on in Spiritism, you might turn to Giancarlo Luchetti's Complementary Spiritist Therapy Systematic Review of Scientific Evidence. Now that really goes more into the components of the Spiritist therapy. And there is unfortunately very little published on scientific evidence. So Dr. Moreira Almeida is doing a tremendous job at publishing videos online through YouTube and in English because he's bilingual. But again, you have to look far and wide to find any published material on the successes. And so why am I so excited about it? People ask. And I must say I did have an issue because when I was in Brazil, I was hearing people talk about Spiritism and visiting the Spiritist centers and seeing how happy the people were. But it was a lot of meetings with individuals who told me extraordinary stories that really galvanized in me the knowingness that something extraordinary was happening here. So at one point, I took a group into the central office of Spiritism in Brasilia, and the man who met us to guide us around was an extraordinary bilingual human being. And I got to know him better on a personal level. And he told me that he had been schizophrenic and had been hospitalized and then had found Spiritism. And as a result of the connection through Spiritism, he was able to manage the phenomena that were happening to him on an inner level. And he became a university professor teaching physics. So that was an extraordinary gift to talk to him. But the same kind of thing happened when I went to the Annapolis Spiritist Hospital, and they invited me to sit in and participate in their disobsession group. And the doctor who was the supervisor, the MD who was the supervisor, pointed out to me and introduced me to one of the members of the group, clearly a medium who was one of their most gifted, and said, "Oh yes, he used to be in the hospital as a patient, but he doesn't take any medication at all. He leads a very normal life with his wife and his family, and he participates in our disobsession group, and he's one of our most gifted mediums." And then again, when I was with my colleague Dagmar Ramos, who's a psychiatrist, she introduced me to many of the mediums at the Hospital Euripides Barçanufo in Goiânia, and the same thing came to me. In other words, I met mediums who had gone through a time in their life where they had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and then had found Spiritism and been able to learn the skills of harnessing their abilities in order to help other people. And we're now functioning as extraordinary mediums within the treatment groups at the hospital. So if you want to learn more, there are a series of videos on Vimeo, which are at the bottom of this particular slide. So you can access them through that particular URL. And again, if you're interested in learning more, as much as there is to learn about the publications, go to the book that I edited, Spiritism and Mental Health. And the film is Spiritism, Bridging Spirituality and Health on Amazon. Okay, so Spiritist therapies in a little bit more detail. So I wanted to say something about the energy work. This makes it very clear that the people who are doing the energy work, and in this case, the man in the olive-colored suit and the woman dressed in a purple outfit, they are not touching the person who is receiving the energy work. So of course, this can be very important within a psychiatric hospital with people who are very vulnerable, that there isn't too much interaction with the practitioners. So the energy work happens by the hands hovering 6 to 8 inches off the body. And the energy work also happens with the practitioner acknowledging and appealing to higher spirits who will help them to channel very positive healing energy into the person who will be receiving. So the figures standing in back of the practitioners represent spirits who are basically on assignment. They have volunteered to assist people in the human realm to accomplish these particular kinds of healing activities. But it's also recognized by the people who are trained to do this kind of energy work that it could actually come from God or higher beings that don't show up as spirit guides, that the highest energy comes down through them and into the person so that, or around the person to assist with their energy field, so that the practitioner's own bioenergy is not what is being used, but instead they are literally just hollow reeds channeling a higher energy. And I mentioned blessed water, that the energy work is done on water. And if you aren't aware of it, you might turn to the work of Masaru Emoto, who showed in some extraordinary ways how the molecules of water can change in response to thoughts that are projected towards them. So in these are molecules of water that are frozen after they have been blessed, as it were. So this particular one right in the center was transmitted with the word love, and you see something very beautiful manifested. In the left corner, you see the molecule of water that has been frozen and photographed, but what was projected onto it was a judgment, you fool. So you see the very difference in the not only the beauty, but the balance being reflected in the designs. So again, prayer and intention can change the molecular structure of water, and they use this in the community centers as well as in the hospitals. Now, the disobsessions meetings bring together about 8 mediums. Some of the mediums might be extraordinarily gifted with medical intuition. Some may be extremely gifted as psychic mediums, in other words, connecting to the spirit realm and being able to see very, very clearly if there is an entity or a spirit that has attached to a patient. And in some cases, the mediums, if they have this particular skill, can actually go into the astral plane or go into the spirit regions and be able to channel the negative entity that is attaching to a particular patient. Very difficult and sensitive work. So people will very often ask me, so are spiritists using ayahuasca, and are they using other kinds of spiritual medicines in order to go into these altered states? Or do they do rituals? What about symbols and incense and all? And I found this particular picture, which is not from Brazil, but shows like a boardroom meeting, which is pretty much the way it is in the Spiritist hospitals as well as in the community centers. There'll be a room with a door on it, so it can be very private. And it's kept, when the disobsession session starts, the door is closed and the light becomes very low. There might be a boom box in the middle of the table, and so they might play some kind of peaceful music to assist people to just make the transition from coming off the road in their cars to being there and focusing in on the work at hand. Then there'll be someone who is taking notes of what the mediums find. And then there's also a supervisor. So in many cases, the supervisor will be a medical doctor. But the supervisor is not only a medical doctor, but is someone who is supervising the mediums and keeping an eye to see if everyone's all right. So in the case, let's say, of someone channeling a negative entity, which can be quite strenuous and difficult, or someone channeling in a way where there's a lot of chaotic emotion, it can be very helpful if another medium will actually back up the first one and give them energy work while they're channeling. I hope that you understand that, so that the fellowship that happens between the mediums offers a tremendous amount of support one to the other. And it's the supervisor who oftentimes assigns these particular tasks. And sometimes the supervisor also becomes the one who basically works with the negative entity, will stand up by a medium who's channeling a negative entity and give therapy to the negative entity, helping them to move into the light. So the training of Spiritist mediums and healers, I would say there's 7 components to this. One is the location. So it happens in a large Spiritist community centers. The smaller community centers oftentimes don't have the numbers of people that they need, or the supervisors who are trained enough to be able to really educate the people who would like that kind of training. The teachers and supervisors are always advanced in their own mediumship, and in some cases, of course, as medical intuitives. And so they have years, I should say decades of experience before they are put in the position of teaching others. The timing of the training, if someone is being trained to participate as one in a group of mediums in a hospital working with patients, it literally takes decades of time before they're trained enough. If someone is working within the community center to help community members who are not hospitalized, but help with them as a healer or as a medical intuitive or as a psychic medium, it may not take quite as long time, but still we're talking about at least a decade of time. The structure is in the training is that people are going to be working in groups, but the way the training generally proceeds is that a student will come into a group, be assigned a group, and then stay with that group as they all move together and advance in their training. So it's not just come Monday, Wednesday, or Friday and join whatever group you want. It's get into your group at one particular time and stay with the supervisor of that group. So they're really looking at going in a great deal of depth. And of course, in any kind of group experience, egos show up, right? Oh, Mary is better than Susie, or Mary seems to be getting more attention from the supervisor than Susie. So jealousies or desire for position, etc. And part of the trajectory in these groups is literally to assist people to move through that kind of difficulties so that the group can work as one together. The seeing and bearing witness to the alignment in groups has brought me to tears, literally, because they are so beautifully in harmony with each other. Another part of the group work, and really the beginning part, is to identify what kind of gifts does each person have. And then it really is up to the supervisor to get quite clear about the gift and also assist each of the mediums to move into cultivating their particular gift. So one person's gift is not always the same as the next person's, but the group and the supervisor are oriented towards each person improving in skill building. And then the supervisor also gives at least once a year a checkup. In other words, how is each person doing? What do they feel like they need? Are they able to stay in balance? Sometimes people need to take a month off and hang out at the beach to stay in balance. They need more nature, or they need more family. So this is always attended to. And in fact, in the training groups, one thing that happens after each training is the supervisor will go around the room to each person one by one and say, how are you? Meaning, are you in balance? Will you be safe when you get in your car to drive home? And the person is asked not to leave the room until they are in balance. And of course, they have help to stay in balance. Another component of the training is the study of spiritual texts. So that would certainly start with what Allan Kardec collated as having come from the higher spirits. And so there are 5 foundational books that Allan Kardec wrote. And by the way, all of them are out in many forms, in many editions on Amazon. But they're also more recent people who have written about Spiritism. Chico Xavier was an extraordinary medium who passed away, I think it was 2002, after having written over 400 books. And when he channeled, he literally just wrote, and what came out on the page didn't need any kind of editing, grammar, spelling, anything. It could just go right into a published form. And he never took any of the money for himself. All of it was donated to elder hostels and helping children who had problems and had to be institutionalized, etc. So Jacob Mello is another author, and he wrote the Past Giver's Manual, which is used in many of the Spiritist centers to train the healers. So this is just a small fraction of the numbers of books that have been written by Spiritists. So going on to the sixth component of training, all of the people who are trained within the Spiritist tradition have a profound dedication to spiritual evolution, their own as well as others who are on this particular, within this philosophy. So that's that doesn't mean that they have to keep themselves only to Spiritism. Many of the Spiritists that I know are very well read and are quite up to date with literature that's being published all over the world in our current day. But what they do have is a kind of rootedness in looking at, well, what is the ideal that we have? Jesus Christ is one example that people, Spiritists, hold very dear. But there are other ideals as well, and that's completely acceptable. But the ideal that they hold is to be really dedicated to be in service to humanity, to be heart-centered, wise, and be able to be in communion with the highest intelligence. And for some people, they call that God. As I mentioned, in the spiritual evolution, that includes moving past competition, jealousy, irritation, etc., to the extent that that's possible and still live on this planet. And also to offer fellowship to all in an egalitarian way. So that doesn't mean that some people who are, let's say, more skilled as mediums get more attention than everybody else. There's a tremendous amount of love that's shared in terms of, compassionate, affiliate kind of fellowship and love. And as I mentioned before, prayers are given before and after each session to reinforce the communion that people are wanting with the higher beings and with each other. Excuse me. So the outcome of this kind of training and this kind of orientation is that people do really dedicate themselves to a life of service. And the mediums who work either in the hospitals or in the community centers are working from the heart. They always work for free. So the idea, and a quote that was used very frequently with me as I was learning more about this, is in Brazil, they would say, what comes from God for free should be freely given. So whether you're a medical intuitive, a psychic medium, a healer, all of it is given for free. And the other thing is that they prefer only to work in groups, because within the groups, as they are formed, as I've mentioned, the groups provide a way to maintain balance and get support. And this is not always easy work to do. Yes, of course, it can be absolutely blissful to commune with God, but we all also have to stay balanced in our life. And sometimes we have problems or losses and grievances that go on in our family life or in our own body. And so to consistently do a good job without falling out of balance can sometimes be challenging. Now, one of the things that might be of interest to you is to just compare the way the psychic mediums and medical intuitives work outside Brazil. And so I'm most familiar with the UK as well as the United States and Australia, but compare that with how the Spiritists work. And from my experience, the psychic mediums and medical intuitives, usually outside of Spiritism, usually work alone. They usually charge a fee for their service, which can be extremely expensive, especially if someone is a TV personality as a medical intuitive. They usually do not have any on-site supervision or annual check. They may not have a spiritual ideal or a goal that they're aspiring towards. And they may not have even a desire for spiritual evolution. So of course, this doesn't include everyone, but these are some generalizations that I've come to through looking into what's going on in various countries. And so I mentioned in the very beginning of this talk that I had been introduced to John of God, who I abbreviate as JOG. And some of you may know that he was an extraordinary, internationally known healer, extraordinarily successful. But a couple of years ago, about 600 women came out of the blue or out of the dark and reported him as having sexually abused them. So he has now been accosted, was jailed, was brought to trial, was completely defrocked, as it were. I mean, you can't defrock someone who's not frocked, but he was his own person, but he basically cannot work anymore. And he is not in prison right now, but he is able, because of COVID, to be in his family home and be able to walk just outside the house, but otherwise stay in the house. So he's basically still in prison. And of course, that's been extremely difficult for the people who were dedicated to him, as well as the people who came to him for healing, to find out that actually there was this shadow going on in the background where he was abusing women, and some of them quite young, under 15 years old. So this is the kind of thing that can happen when people get out of balance and they don't have supervision. And of course, I'm not here to say that any medium is going to fall into a tremendously dark area unless they have supervision. But just he is a illustration of what can happen with the stresses and strains of being a medical intuitive and a healer, and especially one that is in the limelight internationally. So I've had the experience of actually in my private practice of being with people who were recognizing that they were channels or wanted to be medical intuitives and had the gift, and they wanted really to work so that they could prove their value to their ex-wife, or they wanted to achieve some kind of fame or fortune that really was oriented around their ego. So it's, I'm not a person who's here to judge that that's not okay. But if I compare it to where the Spiritists are going, it's very clear that there's a larger philosophy that holds people within the Spiritist tradition that other people may not have if they aren't exposed to that possibility. So a lot of people are asking me now, well, let's bring a Spiritist psychiatric hospital to the United States. There's so many people who could take advantage of it. Or I'm called by people saying, can I get my son or daughter or husband or wife into the Spiritist psychiatric hospital in Brazil? So there is an increasing amount of interest in this, especially as people find out about it. And can we import it? Well, the good news, I think, is that there's more awareness about spiritual emergency and the need to be discerning about spiritual emergency and recognize it's not part of mental illness. And there's a lot more acceptance now of anomalous experiences and a much greater understanding of consciousness. The materialistic reductionist paradigm is losing hold. And there are people who are practicing spirit release and soul retrieval therapies, and that's gaining acceptance, as are forms of energy work and mediumship. But can we really bring the Spiritist way into, let's say, the United States or the UK? Well, I think there are certainly the organization of the various therapies can be brought to the United States, but people in the United States that I've talked to are very ambivalent about this idea that Spiritist mediums never charge a fee. They also feel very ambivalent about the idea that you only work in supervised groups. Most people in our country, the United States at least, are used to mediums having a private practice. And they don't necessarily want to take decades to learn and gather training before they do the most sensitive work. So we have to recognize, I've had to recognize that the way that the Spiritists have chosen to go does expect a profound level of dedication to spiritual evolution and study. And not everyone wants to do that. So that doesn't mean that learning about medical intuition or learning how to develop those skills is wrong without being a Spiritist, but they're just, it's a different way, and it moves into a different kind of path. So this is just one of the groups that came with me, because I lead groups of healthcare providers and change agents once a year for a 7-day seminar in Brazil to really learn about, participate in, and experience the Spiritist therapies. So coming to the end now of my talk, again, there's some resources here. Some of them are repetitions of what you've already seen. But what I haven't mentioned before is there's a film called The Astral City on YouTube, which is a beautiful full feature film that I highly recommend, that was done in Brazil. And the Canadian medical doctor Yvonne Cason has written a book called Touched by the Light, which is a lovely book. And Russell Razaki is a medical doctor and psychiatrist in the UK, and he wrote the book Breaking Down is Waking Up. The last two are not about medical intuition or spiritism, but certainly more about the concepts of some people who are being diagnosed as having mental illness are actually waking up into a much larger world and having a much larger paradigm and able to tap into potentials that are of the highest kind for human beings. So if you're interested in the seminar in Brazil, we aren't doing it this year because of COVID, but we will be next year. And the URL to get more information is on your screen here. And I do train people to learn more about spiritual emergence and emergency, so they can better manage the ups and downs of integrating intense spiritual experiences within themselves, but also to help clients or other people that they may be working with as practitioners. Some of the people go on from the 5 online webinars to also become spiritual emergence coaches, which we offer through the organization Integrative Mental Health for You. So yeah, the next series of the webinars starts on March 16th, which is right around the corner. So I just wanted to say thank you. If you're interested in the seeing the full range of seminars that we offer, the URL is imhu.org/shop. And I am also available for personal consultation. And you can contact me through my phone or my email or the website, emmabragdon.com. So thank you. And I'll stop share and come back and see if there are any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We actually have a lot of questions.
Oh, okay.
And I'm going to take them in order that I got them. The first one was about John of God, but I think you covered that pretty well, really well. Suzanne wants to know about Luis Gasparetto.
What about him?
She just says, can we talk about Luis Gasparetto? I don't know if, Suzanne, you want to add some detail there? Do you know who that person is?
I know who it is, but maybe there's a particular question about him. I mean, Gasparetto has passed, I believe, and he was a totally extraordinary channel for famous artists. So in other words, he could deliberately choose to connect with a famous artist who had died, and then just allow that artist to come through his hands, and then using paintbrushes, paint in the same way that that particular artist would paint, in that same style.
I remember hearing about him, yeah.
It was an extraordinary display of being able to channel not just words in this case, but painting, and in being very true to the style of a particular artist.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so Michelle has 3 questions. She wants to know how or why are negative spirits able to attach to people?
How or why? And why?
How and or why?
Okay, so that's a profound question, and I'm happy to answer it. And I'm just struggling with how can I put this in a nutshell, because
let me ask you the follow-up, because she also said the follow-up, or actually, Carol asks, can possession be dramatization of disowned parts of the self and not a specific different entity? How do you differentiate between them, or do you have to? Does it matter? Right? Is it all manifestations of the same energy?
So again, we're talking about discernment here.
Right.
So the disobsession is as I mentioned, it's given to people who do not respond to other kinds of therapy. So if a person has, let's say, a negative pattern that is just ongoing for them, which is a self-destructive pattern, then hopefully within the more conventional therapies, that would become more obvious and they could work on it directly. But if they weren't responding to any of the other therapies, including Hellinger family systems work, which is an extraordinary family systems kind of therapy that works on a soul level, if people aren't responding and the negativity and possibly self-destruction continues, then the disobsession is done. And so to get to the first question, if a person, let's say, has a tendency towards or an inclination towards over drinking, let's say, this is just an illustration, one example. And so if they have that particular inclination, it will actually resonate or harmonize, attracting an entity that may have died as an alcoholic and still be attached to planet Earth and looking to satisfy that extraordinary desire for alcohol. So they would attach to a person who already has that inclination. Mm-hmm. A person who does not have that inclination for alcohol would not be of interest to that particular negative entity. So how it works is not that the entity goes inside of a person and resides in that person, but attaches into their auric field and may be able to feed them particular ideas and notions. And the notion might be very simple. I need a drink right now, like yesterday. I've got to have a drink. So it would not be unusual for the person to have that idea, but it basically, they have a more intense desire because of the impact of the negative entity. Now, so that's one way it can happen, but another way it can happen, and this would go along if you believe in reincarnation. Let's say someone killed somebody else. Let's call them A and B. Let's say number A in this life killed person B 2 lifetimes ago. And person B is still very angry and feels betrayed. So B in the spirit realm could come back to A 2 lifetimes later and possibly try to insert in that person either to kill himself or herself. So there's a relationship between us that goes on for lifetimes, if you believe in reincarnation. Mm-hmm. And so person A might also have inside themselves a sense of, gee, I did something really wrong in another lifetime. That might not even come to consciousness, but that might still be there. And that is part of what also can allow that person B to attach to them.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's fascinating. Michelle wants to know, do all mental illnesses come back to a crisis of spirituality, or are some due to chemical imbalance or trauma? Like only?
Boy, these are just, wow, questions.
We have a good group.
Really amazing questions. So again, I'm struggling with how do I put that into a nutshell? So I believe that we are here for spiritual evolution. And I do not identify as a spiritist, but I believe in just about every single thing I've heard from the Spiritists. I can ascribe to it. So it's a fabulous philosophy. But so I think in some situations, people have a mental difficulty. I don't like the word illness because it's very clearly from the biomedical model, which is not always helpful for us. But I think people can have a very severe mental issue or mental disturbance based on a physical brain problem. Like I talked to someone once who said, "Oh, I understand what you're doing because my dad was bipolar and he had to have medication for the last 20 years of his life. And we were all struggling to know how to support him. And then we found out later that actually he had a brain tumor that was undiscovered until the autopsy." So, we always have to check for physical issues, but the general paradigm which blankets most of psychiatry, which is depression and anxiety and some of the other disorders, come from a chemical imbalance, is not one that I espouse. So, I know that some psychiatric medications can be extremely helpful for some people, but resting into that notion completely, I think, is a red herring.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. So Marta wanted to know if there's a list of Spiritist hospitals in Brazil that's available for people, and do any offer remote healing sessions. And and Hugo in the chat offered one, and I think two actually. But does somebody maintain a list of all of that? You meant there's quite a few of them, right?
There are 50 of them.
50.
So, yeah. It can, unless you speak Portuguese, it can be quite difficult to be in contact with them. And in some cases, they just aren't interested in promotion.
Right.
So you really have to know where to look and sometimes have a personal connection before you can actually find them.
Right.
And so I can't point you easily to a list of 50 Spiritist psychiatric hospitals. And in terms of getting remote healing, most of the Spiritist psychiatric hospitals are speaking Portuguese. So it's difficult to tune in and contact them if you don't speak Portuguese, because if you call the hospital, it'll be answered by a receptionist who speaks Portuguese. And then after that, there may be some receptivity to offering remote healing. But I'll tell you, the hospitals that I have visited are all just extraordinarily busy, unbelievably busy.
Mm.
And the people who are working there as mediums and healers all have jobs during the day, or whether it's, maintaining their house, or whether it's being a teacher or being a psychiatrist and having an office. They all work for a living, and then they do this volunteer work. And in some cases, they're working long days.
Mhm.
So there are 70 Spiritist community centers in the United States. There are Spiritist centers all over the world, but they are usually quite small and do not offer the kinds of things that I was talking about today.
Mhm. So Hugo, who has some experience with this, wanted to know if you would say that Spiritism was more likely to be successful and well-known in a poor society or economy like Brazil, and less likely to flourish in the first world societies or economies. And I think you touched on that a little bit at the end there about what, the sort of the mindset of each society and how open they would be to that.
Well, one of the things that comes to my mind is that certainly the indigenous cultures that have a more spiritualist approach, in other words, they have honored the spirit realm in their way of life, would take to this immediately.
Mm-hmm.
And it's true that some of the people who are poor in Brazil have indigenous roots. There's been a tremendous amount of intermarriage in Brazil amongst the slaves that came from Africa, or the people who were enslaved who came from Africa, and also the indigenous population. But one of the things that's quite curious now is that the very well educated and very well-moneyed classes, if I can use that word, in Brazil are really flocking to Spiritism right now. I think in the same way that people who have the luxury of extra time and have some extra money go to growth centers like Esalen or Omega in the United States,
Mm-hmm.
or go to a retreat in Mexico where they can also take ayahuasca. So it's not that it's about whether you're poor or whether you're wealthy, but my sense is that actually we're in a time now of huge transition on the planet, and more people are recognizing the existence of the subtle realms and the need to be able to negotiate within the subtle realms, which includes healing and includes interaction with spirits.
Right. And I think that's a great thing. I'm really excited about that.
Yeah, it is
Because
exciting.
I think there's a partnership developing between, those who are open to it and those who are wanting to be helpful and healing in the, on the other side of the veil.
Yeah.
And I think it's really exciting.
Yeah.
I'm just going to read this from Suzanne. She says, would you say that this is all connected to the soul's work through each lifetime to raise the soul's vibration, to be closer to the divine, and to be able to work at the highest level to help heal people in their afterlife? I feel that the Spiritists are sent to enable souls in trauma to release themselves, to become a higher self, and to live their life purpose. All of this is to facilitate a better life in this life.
Can I just answer that by saying yes?
I think so. I totally agree. Yes. I think, Suzanne, we're all on the same page.
Okay.
And she said she'd love to bring your teachings to Wales. So Suzanne, get in touch with Emma. I think that's a great connection.
Yeah.
There was one question about positive spirit attachments. Do people find that there are positive spirits that attach to people? Helpful spirits, maybe? Do those need to be cleared? Is that something that people
so
ask?
one of the stories I didn't tell because I knew I was running out of time in the middle was one of the first true Spiritist centers that I visited in Sao Paulo. I walked in to be introduced to the woman who was the head of it. Lovely woman. She must have been all of 4'9" and probably 70 years old, wearing heels about that high. And she looked up at me and smiled. And then she said, you must have come in 2 taxis. And I thought, what is she saying here? Is she talking about my being an ugly American and having too much luggage? Or does she think I'm fat and I need, 2 vehicles or luxury, or what's going on? And I looked at her, I said, what do you mean? And she said, you have so many spirit guides that with you, they couldn't all fit in 1 taxi with you. So she was very aware of the spirit guides and who they were. She named them.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so she was able to be, have very, very clairvoyant abilities, able to see these beings. So whether you say they were attached to me or they were just hanging out with me or they were interested in learning what I was learning, but it occurred to me from our conversation that these were actually beings that were assisting me and inspiring me and energizing me. And it was moving towards the zone where I could write books and create films about this and bring it to a wider audience. And I'm certainly not the only one who's doing this, but I am one of the only ones who's been able to write about it from a position of participating with it. Mm-hmm. So in Brazil, I was acknowledged as a well-trained medium from the beginning. Mm-hmm. And so that offered me a different perspective. And I was invited literally to participate as one of the mediums in their work.
Yeah, I mean, you're definitely facilitating this partnership, right, with the spirit world. So we have a question in from YouTube that says, how does a channeler protect themselves from intruding spirits when they're channeling? For example, if they think they're channeling a dead person, but the actual spirit coming through is a mischievous one, how do the spiritists think John of God was taken over?
Oh, wait, that was a curveball right at the end.
Yeah, exactly.
So that maybe it's 2 questions. Should we take?
Was John of God taken over, or was that? Do you believe that, or is it just that he fell into sort of the power, the desire for power and fame?
That's really a subject that comes up for discussion a lot, and I don't claim to be the only authority. I do feel like I can speak from a position of authority. I took 60 groups there and spent a lot of time there, and had a personal relationship with the medium, but I was never abused by him. It was a very respectful relationship. So my sense, and when I first heard about the abuses, I thought, wow, how could he be surrounded by so many good mediums who never saw what was happening? That doesn't make any sense to me. And then it occurred to me, okay, so one of the properties that some shamans have is the ability to veil what's going on with them. So that's a possibility that he was able to veil his shadow behavior. And then I thought, okay, so is he like a sex addict that needs help that needs an intervention, and he knows it, but he knows he's a sex addict, but he doesn't want to deal with that level of shadow. And he is an illiterate person who is obviously not reading books because he's illiterate, and he doesn't participate in the kind of culture that we have in the United States called, go to a center for help with addictions. That's not any part of his personal culture. So my own sense is that, yes, there was definitely some kind of activity going on in terms of the darker entities that have bad intention. And what actually was happening there is I really don't want to go into it any further than that.
Okay, so in terms of people who are channeling,
yes, thanks for going back to that.
Yeah, how do you recommend that they protect themselves?
So the idea is you will not be approached by a negative being unless you have something in you that resonates with that actually is an attractor to that being. And so it's very human. I know I'm not perfect. I don't know a lot of people who are, right. But the idea is that if you dedicate yourself in prayer to being in communion with the highest intelligence that carries love and wisdom, so that energy is pouring through you, there aren't any negative entities that are going to come and want to attach. They might show up, say hi, but they won't be able to.
There's no receptor for them to bind to, right?
Exactly.
There's nothing. Yeah, there's no affinity there.
No hook.
Okay, so I have one last question, and this is for me because I'm looking at the time, and I want to thank everybody for their really fabulous questions. And this question is just something from me. I'm just wondering, going back to the concept of spiritual emergency in the United States, and I'm wondering if in your practice or in, are you seeing an uptick in spiritual emergency?
Absolutely.
You are?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And I think people are feeling more comfortable talking about it because there is more language, and there's more opportunity. Like if you Google spiritual emergency or if you Google psycho-spiritual issues, you can come up with people, you can come up with books, you can come up with all manner of things. So it's easier to cross that bridge into maybe I'm not a lunatic, like my psychiatrist is telling me.
Yes, exactly. And I remember, so you were at Institute of Transpersonal Psychology in 1987, and wasn't it around that time there was a Spiritual Emergence Network? Was it Stanislaus Grof or something?
Yes, in 1980, Stan and his wife Christina started the Spiritual Emergence Network, and that happened first. The office was at Esalen, but then it later moved actually to the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
So we had the offices there. And I was a volunteer there for 7 years. So I wrote, I was editor of the newsletter and started a journal, and participated in terms of offering support to others.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is a life's work, and so important. And I just love that there's so much more language around this now, and so much more availability for people to really to not go into despair and think I'm going crazy. Right?
Yeah.
Really wonderful. So just want to make sure that was not a question from YouTube. Okay. So thank you so much. We really appreciate your time. And this is really the other thing that I'm getting is a lot of thank yous and that this is brilliant. This is really brilliant. So I just want to remind you, if you want to get in touch with Emma, she's your website is emmabragdon.com, right?
That's my personal website, is emmabragdon.com. But the website, in order to learn more about the Spiritist Centers and that seminar, as well as to take courses in spiritual emergency, is IMHU.org. That's what the courses are.
Right. And there's another one coming up on Tuesday, starting Tuesday.
Yes.
Tuesday. Yes.
Yes, exactly. A series of 5 webinars. Yeah.
Yes. Wonderful. Okay. Well, thank you very much. For the people who are just waking up, good morning. Have a great day. And
What do
for
you
the
mean,
people in,
Judy?
what's that?
What do you mean by waking up?
No, I'm sorry, in Tasmania, who joined us at 6 a.m.
I'm just teasing.
And for the people who are probably getting ready to finish their day in Europe, thank you for joining us. This was really wonderful. And we'll see you next time.